Starting today, Korea has in place what many hope will be the last set of social restrictions over the next 2 weeks before the country's transition into an endemic phase of this pandemic. For more on these prospects, I have Professor David Kwak from Sooncheng University. Professor Kwak, welcome back.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Professor Marcel Carlin at the Oregon Health and Science University live on the line. Professor Carlin, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise, nice to see you, Sunny.
Right, Professor Kwak, under the new guidelines here in the country, a total of 10 people can gather for social purposes, while drinking, dining and other leisure venues can cater to patrons until midnight. Are these measures in line with our current strategy against COVID-19, do you think?
Well, yes, I would think so. I think the government is quite eager to put us back to the normal lives, or at least as close to it, before that we used to have before the pandemic. But I don't think these minor changes, such as changing the cap on the numbers of people gathering from 6 to 8, and also extending a little bit of the restaurant venues of their curfew hours from, let's say, 10 p.m. to 12 a.m., is not going to give too much of an impact in the sense that we're already heading downwards in the confirmatory cases. The only regret that I have about this is that I personally feel that all this loosening of social distancing guidelines has begun a little prematurely. So it created these massive confirmatory cases in which we another change or extension of certain changes is not going to really make that much of a change in its transmission. So the fashion of decline that we're currently seeing in the graph is not going to change that much, because I believe people nationwide are already feeling they're on their own in regards to taking care of or protection against COVID-19. So when they're not really following closely of their social distancing guidelines already, minor changes made at this point is really not going to impact that much either.
I see. Professor Kwak, as my colleague Minjung mentioned earlier, if COVID-19 tallies here in the country remain within capacity, authorities have spoken about the possibility of rolling back all remaining restrictions with the exception of indoor face mask mandates. What, in your view, are the prospects perhaps of such a scenario?
Well, once again, I personally feel that it shows us how eager the government is to put us back to the title of being on the normal level of life. Medically speaking, though, as a medical professional, I need to stay in the most conservative way in regards to medical protection of people against certain viral sources. What's the haste? I mean, my question is, why haste it so much that while certain groups of professionals are coming up with concerns over such tactics? I agree that we are currently being managed because we are having stabilization in severe case numbers, and also even though it has risen to a great amount, the death rate still has not gone anything beyond that was expected. So I do agree with the stabilization of management, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're completely okay to just all of a sudden let loose of everything and just go back to complete normal life, because even still, there is that level of uncertainty in the future that we have no idea of what can happen with this particular virus. Even though there is said to be a medicine that can prevent a certain level of death, it's not still a curative medicine. It can only work within a certain period of time after the show up of symptoms. And we have no level of protocols we can only follow through to completely cure these diseases. So even though I'm very happy that the government foresees that we're going to see an even greater stabilization and even greater management of this disease, as a medical personnel, I'm not able to completely comply or agree with the government's current idea of letting loose all our guards just yet.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Carlin, over in the US, the Omicron subvariant BA2 appears to be dominating COVID-19 infections there, amid speculation that it may fuel a fresh resurgence. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's right, Sunny. We're seeing that the BA2 variant, which is a sort of strain, it's one type of Omicron, is now rapidly replacing BA1 as the dominant cause of all new infections. It's not entirely unexpected. I do think that it will probably lead to a small rebound in a number of cases. Already in the United States, we have, of course, we're all, globally speaking, in the United States as well, we're all at the tail end of this large surge that was the Omicron wave, which was largely BA1. And now we're sort of waiting to see what happens next. If you look at the graph over time of the surges that we've all experienced, you notice that peaks have come roughly 3 or 4 months apart. And so we've just emerged from one, and it seems likely that we could be due for maybe another smaller peak in a couple of months, maybe in early summer. I say smaller because BA2 is also, if you've had BA1 or if you've been vaccinated, you still have immunity against BA2 that is protective. And so while BA2 is surging in some sense, it's accounting for a large proportion of the number of cases, it's having to find new people to infect who have already either had BA1 or they've been fully vaccinated. So it's a bit harder territory for BA2. So I do believe that while we will have a small peak due to BA2, it won't be quite as bad as the Omicron wave that we've seen in the past.
Right, I see. And perhaps against that backdrop of concerns, Professor Kurland, the FDA and CDC cleared the path for second booster doses to those aged 50 and above without consulting their independent vaccine panels. How do you explain this break from norm, so to speak?
Right. So for your listeners, most probably know that in the United States, the FDA approves something and a drug for use, and then the CDC offers recommendations. So the FDA says you can, and the CDC says you should. And as you point out, normally there's an advisory panel, an independent advisory panel to each of those two bodies that helps make that decision for them. And in this case, that didn't happen. We had approval of both the FDA and the CDC for a second booster, so a fourth dose, in some individuals that came very, very rapidly. And it's unusual. I would say this, on the one hand, you have a lot of data showing, remember, this is not a new drug anymore. We have 214 million people in the United States who are fully vaccinated. Most of them got an mRNA vaccine of some kind. And around the world, many more millions of people. So the drug is a known one. Secondly, we have data from the Israeli trial in which they really looked at safety signal of a fourth dose, a second boost. And so I think there was a lot of information already about the risks. There were no new risks that had emerged. This had been really discussed in committees previously. And on the other hand, we have what you were pointing out, which is this kind of concerning rise in the number of BA2 cases. So I believe that these regulatory bodies made a decision that more expeditious approval was really beneficial to prevent any possible surge among vulnerable people rather than delaying for committee meetings without a lot of new information that would provide a basis for changing the decision.
Right, and talking about vulnerable people, Professor Kwok, second booster doses here in the country are being offered to those at high risk, but the uptake appears to be slow. How do you explain this reality, and what do you propose perhaps to boost the uptake of the fourth dose in the country?
Right. So I think in that regard, we need to have a look at what really happened realistically in a clinical world. The lack of compliance by the appropriate targeted group of people who were allowed to receive the fourth shot, meaning the second booster shot, actually got infected. So during their quarantine, they were not able to actually get those second boosters. Those people, currently, the second boosters are allowed to people who are being contained in the nursing homes or are admitted in hospitals of those who are very elderly of their ages. But as we have seen in the past couple of weeks or so, with the massive numbers of infection daily, those people contained also in the nursing homes, did go through cluster infections, and many of them were infected in the past couple of weeks, disabling them from actually receiving the shots. So I don't think it's mainly the compliance issue that we're dealing with the lack of injections with the second booster, but it's more of a physical issues that people weren't physically able to receive them. And I'm hoping in the near future that'll catch up so that people who need the second shot of the booster will start to get it. But I'm also hoping that it won't just be allowed to those people who are contained in hospitals. I'm hoping that it'll be allowed to anybody above 50, just like in the US, so that people who feels that they need to receive the second booster to have sort of the boosted immunity against COVID-19 can choose to do so. So I think it's more of the matter of physical hindrance that actually blocked them from receiving the second shot.
Right. And Professor Kurlin, staying with second booster shots, perhaps I should have asked you this earlier, but where do you stand on the debate over their necessity?
Well, if we go back to the information we have, the Israeli study, they took about 500,000 people, a bit more, and gave some of them the second booster and some did not get it. About 58% got the second booster. And after a very relatively short period of time, I think it was 40 days or something like that, they saw a substantial drop in mortality in those who got the second shot, the second booster. I think they had about 92 deaths in the group that got the booster compared with 232 who did not get the booster. So that's a really substantial difference in a short amount of time. And I think the reason we saw such a strong signal there was because they really chose the group that's most at risk for severe infection and complications and death. They took people, over 65. And I think that that's the group where that should really consider strongly getting a booster. So I think if you're in the older age bracket, if you are a vulnerable person in terms of immunocompromise or comorbidities like diabetes, like metabolic syndrome, hypertension, you might want to consider getting a second booster.
Right. And Professor Kurlin, as my colleague mentioned earlier, the WHO has issued a warning against a new mutant, the XE variant of Omicron. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Of course, yeah. This is one of these features of the reality of viral diseases. Viruses change over time, particularly if they're infecting a large number of people. And obviously, Omicron or COVID itself is the poster child for this. So we have sort of three subspecies of Omicron that were discussed a bit earlier in your segment that are recombinant viruses. What does that mean? It means that there are two viruses, let's take, for example, Delta and Omicron, that have mixed so that you have a new virus that has features of each. It's a sort of a shortcut for the virus to acquire new variations and configurations. It can only happen in nature if you have a person who's infected with both viruses at the same time. And what happens is during the viral replication, there's some mistakes made and you get a hybrid virus that's made of the two. So XE is made up of BA1 and BA2. It's a lot of it is BA2, including the spike protein. And the thing that's notable about this XE variant is that it's perhaps even a bit more transmissible than BA2. BA2 had a substantial transmission advantage over BA1 of about maybe 30%, and XE is another 10% more transmissible on top of that. So that may become significant if a sufficient number of people become infected. That advantage may be significant.
Right, I see. And moving forward, Professor Kwok, so I suppose the chance of witnessing more variants in the future is very, very high then. Having said that, what are the chances then of perhaps coming across a variant that proves to disrupt once again our sense of normality?
Well, I guess it'll depend also on the time length of immunity we would last to have. From the injections, it's a rough estimate, but we have seemed to have had about 3 months or so of its effectiveness lasting, but also with natural immunity, since a lot of the population have now gotten an infection, seems to last a little longer than that. They're currently speculating possibly from 6 months to maybe even in the span of a year that the immunity against COVID-19 would last. But also, if the time overlaps when a new, stronger variant, meaning possibly being more transmissible, at the time where the immunity level among population starts to become very low, there is a chance that that'll also create another resurgence of COVID-19 among the population. And I'm hoping dearly that'll be a strain which is very, very weak in the sense that it won't create any severe cases or even death for the matter. But also, if you look in the past in the history, viruses that mutate tended to become weaker and faster. If you think of it this way, a virus which kills a person immediately will not be able to transmit to another person because the host dies. But a virus quick enough to be transmitted to another person while not completely killing the host yet becomes more transmissible and larger in its amount and numbers. So in that regard, if it repeats itself of mutations in such regard, it is more probable, and I'm hoping, that the variants that are to be happening in the future will likely be more fast in its transmission, but less harmful. So I'm hoping for that direction.
And I'm hoping for that as well, Professor Kwok. Also, we've touched upon the growing prevalence of long COVID here in the country amid mounting caseloads in recent weeks. Professor Kwok, what more can you tell us about these post-infection symptoms from your own experience within the medical arena?
Well, I can actually tell you two different things. I've seen some patients actually come in with long-lasting effects from prior infection, such as brain fog, such as fatigue. Some people actually claim they were having breathlessness, very mildly, but still. But also some people had chest pains and whatnot that we had to give examinations for. I can also attest to some of those symptoms myself, as I have gone through infection a couple of weeks ago. Currently, I'm having a little nasal congestion still, even when I'm not having the infection itself. I'm also having a little bit of fatigue, which definitely makes a difference for daily activities that I normally have. I am seeing that quite more commonly these days in my clinics as well. So I guess in the medical aspect, those are some of the symptoms and syndromes that we would have to deal with, at least for the time in the future.
Right, it remains a challenge to be tackled. And Professor Kurlin, do share with us a bit about the efforts in the U.S. to tackle long COVID.
Yeah, I fully acknowledge the comments that Dr. Kwok made. It's a really challenging problem. As many as 15% of people who have gotten COVID are thought to have long COVID. But if you really go into detail and ask people very closely if they have any residual symptoms after COVID, as many as perhaps 70% will say they have one or more symptoms. It's a challenging problem medically because it's likely a heterogeneous set of conditions. We don't really even know why people have quote unquote long COVID. It may be that the immune system, well, there's several hypotheses. One is that there's continuing cellular or the residual cellular damage, direct cellular damage by the viral infection itself. Then there are some thoughts about autoimmune responses or ongoing inflammatory response, even though the virus is gone. And then finally, in some cases, maybe there's a small amount of viral material still present that's provoking an immune response. And as Dr. Kwok pointed out, the symptoms of long COVID can be really varied, from including neurologic symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms, constitutional symptoms like fatigue and weakness, fever. And so it's very difficult because of the many different causes and many different effects to have one treatment. And then, of course, there are the large numbers. I think symptomatic therapy, well, on the bright side, although many people have long COVID, usually these symptoms resolve over a period of months in most people. And in the meantime, symptomatic treatment for the effects, the specific effects they're having, help. And then there are sort of ancillary services like support groups and information like that. In addition, there's some sort of new studies coming out that are trying to deal with some of the specific causes. One set of symptoms is thought to be due to dysfunction of the vagus nerve, which is an important physiologic response that governs a lot of autonomic systems like swallowing and heart rate. And you can imagine that if that nerve is doing poorly, you're going to have a lot of very severe symptoms. And there are a few studies showing that there are some physical maneuvers that can be done with augmented counterpulsation, basically inflatable cuffs on the arms and legs that can stimulate the vagus nerve and hopefully recover function. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do, but it really is a very challenging problem and a quite large one in terms of the number of people who are affected.
Right, because research is still evolving, of course. Right, Professor Curlin, as always, thank you very much for your insights today. And Professor Kwok here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.